Hello, I'm Ben Bojko, Tech Director at Blue Cadet.
Hi, I'm Ellice Engdahl. I am Digital Collections and Content Manager at the Henry Ford.
I'm Matt Elliott. I'm Head of Creative and Digital Experiences at the Henry Ford.
And I'm Brett Renfer, Creative Director at Blue Cadet. Let's get our screen share started. Perfect. Awesome. Our talk today is called Curator Brain Meet AI Brain. And we're going to talk about this experience we created together called the Connections Table. It's an experience that demonstrates the connectedness of the Henry Ford's collection through curated created concepts. It's a real mouthful right there, and AI-generated visual connections. So essentially, it creates this web of connectedness through a mishmash of human and AI-created pieces. And we're going to talk about both today and really focus on how we got there. As you might notice in this GIF, it is a touch-centric experience, which in the era of COVID, we know is problematic, and we'd love to talk about that more in the Q&A. That will not be as much of our talk today.
Great. So for those of you not familiar with the Henry Ford, I kind of give you a really quick rundown and also talk about kind of why connectedness. So we actually have 4 venues within our campus, which is a 250-acre campus. We have over 26 million artifacts. We have 80+ historic structures, and right now over 100,000 digitized artifacts. So we really kind of use connectedness to talk about the collections across these different venues, both physical and digital.
So this is kind of a case study in that connectedness and yet also disparateness of our collection. So it's very broad. These are the top 10 artifacts most viewed in our digital collections during Q2 of this year. So you can kind of see some themes. There are some racing photos and a race car. The photos relate to the 24-hour of Le Mans race that was made popular in Ford versus Ferrari recent movie. There's some African-American related artifacts. So the Rosa Parks bus, a slave collar, and a segregated fountain. And then there's just some weird outliers. So Henry Ford's first car, the quadricycle, inexplicably some slate pencils, and then a letter that was allegedly sent from Clyde Barrow of Bonnie and Clyde fame to Henry Ford. So it gives you a sense of like there's some themes, but then also in a greater sense, everything does relate.
So again, just to kind of talk about our diversity in the physical sense as well. We have everything from the Eames Mathematica exhibit to being able to build your own Model T right on site. Well, not currently, but hopefully soon again. And all the way to in Greenfield Village, which is historical buildings, and we actually have a living, working, functional farm. So we really, just to kind of stress the diverse range of both experiences and collections that we have.
And to capture that diversity, a lot of our work together has really gone into unpacking that connectedness and the larger themes on the museum floor. We did that through films, interactive media, audio tours, and even some augmented reality, but we hadn't really made an experience explicitly about this theme. So we'd always been working towards connecting back to the museum's mission. And in particular, in this second set of projects that we did together, we wanted to really double down on that aspect of innovation and use that to untangle that connectedness puzzle.
So where did we begin when we started this? We were actually in a really good place. So like Matt mentioned, we have tens of thousands of digitized artifacts. So we'd been digitizing our collections for close to a decade. Those records had fairly standard metadata applied by humans and delivered from our collections management database to a robust online data structure with APIs. So though we had to do some work along the way to extend that for this project, we weren't having to start from scratch or recreate the wheel. And then we were also already used to this idea of talking about connections in smaller, more atomic ways. So since we've been digitizing, we've been integrating our digital collections into different digital content, which might be artifact sets, blog posts, or videos like the Connect 3 that's illustrated here. So our Connect 3 videos take 3 artifacts that are seemingly disparate and align them together with some theme. So the ones you see here are aligned by salt. So you have salt glazed pottery, pickles, brined and salt, and then old salts on a dock. So we're kind of used to already doing this smaller connecting, but we were intrigued by the idea of like making that larger, and could machine learning and AI help us with that?
Unmute. So as you step into the museum, you see quite a disparity or seeming disparity of artifacts and of collections. So you can see this giant DC-3 airplane that's kind of floating above you. You can see a full-size diner. You can see an exploded Model T and all the pieces and parts that go into that. So we wanted to try to start to really focus in on the answer, like how do these things connect? Why do we collect the things we collect, and how do we think about our collections? And that really led us on this connectedness, kind of path. And we really want to designate a space in the museum, which we've called the intersection of innovation, to kind of explain that and to focus in on that connectedness, and to give our guests a tool in which to explore and understand our collections. So we really looked at it kind of as a space. Again, it's the physical center of the museum, and we wanted to kind of be able to focus kind of from a micro to a macro level on what it is to be connected, and again, just be able to give people an understanding of our collection and how we think about it.
So our table is the little diagram towards the top of this meta diagram. And so, one of the things it was supposed to be doing in this kind of experience gradient is digging into that understanding of connectedness. And we wanted to challenge ourselves to think, we've been doing this together with the Henry Ford for years now, trying to think about how do we translate these stories into something that shows rather than tells? How do we let people interact with this story? And is there a way to do that, with this like kind of big idea of connectedness? So really early on, we actually started playing with AI as an idea to get at that, to try to say, can we, interconnect the entire collection and show visually, and maybe let people interact with something like that. So Ellice gave me a huge chunk of images that we processed through this algorithm called ImageNet that classified the image. And we used a separate algorithm called Tisney to cluster these images by visual similarity. And it had some pretty cool moments. You start to say like, oh, here's this kind of car and this photo of a bridge and this person in a workshop and this toy all together. And yeah, I see how those are connected. And it was really fun. This is a quick kind of tool we smashed together. It was cool to kind of move around, and it became this kind of interesting hypothesis for us. Can AI demonstrate connectedness? Could this be this way in for us to show rather than tell, and give people some agency to dig into connectedness and play and move around?
Yeah, and maybe this title is a little bit of a spoiler, but we immediately started to think about the role of AI and what it can play in this project. Primarily, we asked ourselves, can AI demonstrate connectedness, and can I think like a curator in the most literal sense? So we had a plan, and you can already probably, some of you will be able to see some of the flaws in there, but take any digitized object, process it with an AI algorithm, and output some form of subjective interpretation. And
Perfect
we
plan.
yeah, nothing can go wrong. We had plenty of ideas, of what that interpretation might include. Some sensical, lots not so much, but it was a fun experiment.
And I think we went through some interesting kind of back and forth collaborative work on this as well, obviously, and kind of just the idea, I guess, to bring to some curators, like, do you think that there are certain parts of our collection that are gross or boring? Definitely led to some very lively conversations.
Indeed.
So we stuck to our process for a bit, and we tried a few different techniques to tackle this subjective interpretation puzzle. One technique was looking at it categorically. So essentially, give an AI an image or some sort of piece of media or metadata, try to recognize something interesting about it, and extrapolate some degree of interpretation from it. The second technique was a little bit more ambitious and also much more ambiguous, where we tried to train an AI to categorize subjectively and interpret objects that way. And our first prototypes were pretty upsetting. So the idea of extracting just tags from an image were mostly fine. There were definitely a couple of offensive outliers, some of which you'll probably easily spot in here already. Emotion recognition didn't work at all like we had dreamed. Obviously, with a lot of objects in the collection, you couldn't just easily extract some emotion, even though some, subjectively people might infer some to the object. AI didn't do quite as well. And really, the more we tried for AI to tackle this type of categorization, the more we realized that the curators had actually already done a much better job than AI ever could.
Yeah, so this GIF is just kind of showing you some of our metadata, and this is the metadata I was talking about, where human beings actually go in and look at the artifacts and apply these very concrete subject terms to them.
Yeah, and here's a sample of our subjective transfer learned model, which worked okay, but there were many outliers, and we really only tested on a very small sample set for artifacts and for tags and trainers, actually. So really, what this came out to was mostly just reflecting the bias of the trainer itself or themselves. And that was obviously a huge issue. And in our case, quickly negated the whole idea of this process.
But it wasn't all bad. I think for us, you can even see in the screenshots we're showing, it's really focusing on a single object. And maybe we were going to eventually get to something that kind of visualized there, but we kind of hit the stopping point pretty quickly. And I think at the same time, we found some of these other prototypes. So this is sorting the, I think most of the collection by color that got to this point of saying like, oh, here's these ways to look at the collection as a whole, and had some kind of pretty fascinating outputs. So similarly, this idea of building these kind of visual gradients, a few of you all might have seen these types of experiments before. We kind of plugged these through those existing libraries. That was really awesome. We did have to do a lot of tweaking, and the theme we'll come to a lot is this idea there's sort of nothing out of the box. As you can see in all of our prototypes, we're working with something, working with a library, and then suddenly we're like, this doesn't quite work, or it's, as Ben was saying, kind of upsetting. So we had this thing, we knew that connectedness was going to be interesting, and the moments where we could look at the entire collection, we could see what's so fascinating about Henry Ford. Even if you kind of puzzle over this GIF, you see this crazy diversity of objects, and you start to imagine, what are the things that happen in this space between these things? How do these all come together? What kind of bigger story is this telling? And all those prototypes we were doing did not do that. And so we were like, how do we get to this bigger story? It seems like we've kind of hit a dead end.
So how do we find that authentic narrative for this experience? We knew that kind of looking at the models and prototypes that AI was very good at certain types of connectedness, but how do we deliver on a rich experience that our curators kind of excel at? And we sort of started to look at that and kind of ask the questions like, can AI think like a curator? No, it can't really do that. Can it demonstrate connectedness? And we kind of landed on maybe that's not the right question. And this kind of took us back to the drawing board a little bit. So we kind of had to work backwards about kind of knowing what AI could do, and how could we then use it to be unique to the Henry Ford. And it seems obvious again that like AI would be this great, amazing tool. And I think we had to find a way to plug it in and tie it in with our curators to really kind of tell the stories that we wanted to tell with the table.
Yeah, so we ended up kind of taking a step back and what did that look like? So we wanted again to get back to that idea that had intrigued us in the beginning, which is this giant web of connections, and how our collection really does make sense. So we started with giant sheets of butcher paper, put an artifact, a key artifact from our collection in the middle of each one. This one is Model T. A couple of our associate curators who are our content leads on the project put together some basic rules, which is, okay, start from the Model T, list out concepts that relate to the Model T, and then from each concept, go on to new artifacts. So this screenshot is fairly early on, as we didn't have too much stuff, but then curators would stop by and they would add concepts and they would add artifacts and et cetera, et cetera. And finally, we ended up with these like giant, dense, colorful webs of like artifacts and concepts and artifacts.
The only one that fit on one piece of paper too, right?
There were some lines from like one web to the next web, so you could theoretically like put all three together. But people worked on these in different ways. So some people would just kind of pass by one in this common space. It was in our curatorial offices. So people would pass by and add something, or we also set up kind of formal and informal times for people to gather if they wanted to bounce ideas off of each other. And as we were doing this too, we ended up with these giant sheets that were just dense with these ideas. And some were very concrete, so more like our metadata, very, very, you couldn't really argue with the fact that the Model T is a car or whatever. But then the ones that we found most interesting were either concepts that potentially open themselves to multiple interpretations, like for the Model T limited choices, or even concrete concepts, like one we ended up with was weaving, that we could add these really interesting artifacts to. So for weaving, for instance, we ended up with a few of the objects that ended up on that were an Oriole's nest, a cable stranding machine, and a childhood artwork by Edsel Ford where he wove a bear. So it kind of, I think, recentered our idea of like what was really interesting about that idea of connection.
So how do we translate this into an actual experience? We've got these super cool and dense and fascinating mind maps from our curatorial team. We've got these amazing kind of models and prototypes with AI. How do we start to kind of take these two things and kind of smash them together and make a rich, meaningful, and purposeful experience for our guests?
So we turn to one of our favorite processes, which is bodystorming. So this idea of role-playing interactions at scale together and using that kind of brainstorming ethos. So allowing for this kind of free exchange of ideas, like, why don't we try this? Why don't we try this? And we did that with Blue Cadet and Henry Ford all kind of together in the same space. And in a way, we followed a little bit when we're doing this talk. We talked a little bit about where we started, talked about goals and things like that we all knew were to be true. And then we had Brian and Catherine, the curators that Ellice talked about, walk us through the mind maps and walk us through where they started, where they got to. And then we split up into groups. We got together some kind of lo-fi prototypes. So a mix of giant Post-its, stickers, little cutouts of actual objects. And we had each group prototype and create a concept saying, like, how would people interact? Should AI be involved? What might AI do? You can tell this is pre-quarantine because look at how short all of our hair is. It's great. Those are the days. And what was really interesting is not only did the two approaches have some commonalities in interaction. So there's this idea of kind of connecting objects and actually following and kind of revealing the mind maps in a way. But they also had this connection in the way that they used AI. So both groups said, yes, AI should be included, and it should be a kind of a side. It should be a way to kind of jump to something else or see this huge connection. So here is this donut, which we'd love you to ask questions about in the Q&A, that connects to fire and death. And it's extending out to way more objects through this conceptual AI connection. And so we landed with this idea of users being able to kind of come up and either select or randomly land on an object, getting linked through a kind of gestural interaction to a concept. And then from there, being linked to even more objects. So being able to kind of cruise these connections and do so sort of infinitely. But then having this sort of redheaded stepchild, that the AI connection that kind of splits off from there and allows you to kind of jump to another section of the collection to see a bigger kind of volume of objects and see something like a little bit more unpredictable. And hint at that bigger connection, that this whole collection is kind of interwoven together. And then from there, you can kind of jump back on the rails. And of course, you can kind of repeat and go back and forth. And so for us, we felt like we were getting to the answer to these questions. What could be something that's unique to the Henry Ford generally? It's about connectedness. Can AI kind of reinforce that connectedness? And so in a way, we kind of landed more on principles of what we wanted the experience to be like. We want it to be playful and light and really dig into that, what we loved about looking at the mind maps and cruising through all these awesome concepts. We want it to be open-ended. Connectedness is not about a static web of these objects being locked into space. It's about something that is fluid and playful and exploratory. We want it to be human-driven. So both the interaction and the content is created by people, primarily, with technology supporting that. And based on that, there's this quote kind of cribbed from Calm Technology, which we love, this idea of amplifying the best of technology and the best of humanity. So great content created by smart people that's augmented by this tech layer that can expand it and go beyond perhaps what just people could do.
Cool. So at this point, we kind of had this sense of like what we were aiming for, but we had to make it happen. And so Ben and I are going to talk a little bit about the collections metadata and what was going to be included, and then how that played with the AI and the ML, how those two factors interplayed. So even once we knew what we wanted to build, we had this kind of semi-constant back and forth going to figure out like what algorithms we needed for the machine learning and AI, and then what was going to be included on the table and how that was going to look. I'm just going to call out a couple things here, and happy to answer questions about the other stuff on here during the Q&A. One that we went back and forth on was, do we exclude black and white artifacts? So you saw the color gradations that Brett showed. We're a 90-year-old museum. We have many black and white photos and other artifacts. Even a lot of our 3D artifacts are black and white. So do we leave those off, or do we omit two-dimensional items altogether in favor of objects? But then a lot of our color comes in through things that are color photographs or pamphlets, booklets, things like that, since we do have so many industrial artifacts that are basically black boxes with dials and knobs. So we had to kind of figure out how that worked, and it was a combination of like putting certain things on the table, but then also tweaking the algorithms to make that work. And then the one other thing I wanted to call out quickly was where is different data going to live? So what was going to be very unique to this experience that could live in our floor experience CMS? What was going to be something we thought we might repurpose again, which could live in our APIs? And then what of the experience made sense to back all the way up to our collections management system?
Yeah, and a few answers to Ellice's questions just now came through finding the flow of data through the entire museum ecosystem, right? So here's sort of this abstracted layer cake, if you will, of different data pieces, and data flowed from the THF collections on site initially, and then to hosted solutions for the website. And then there was an explicit layer for the exhibit CMS where only exhibit specific content lived. And then ultimately, all of that data got funneled down to the exhibit PC, and that's where we generated the AI output using a coalesced version of all of that data together. Similar to what Ellice said, there's a lot more detail here. We can get into that in the Q&A if you're interested. But the main takeaway for us was identifying the important parts and making sure that the editing experience is actually usable and will be used over the course of time, and that we don't duplicate any data, and that this whole system can scale as we're digitizing, or as the museum is digitizing more and more artifacts. And if you remember, our UX concept pretty much relied on the fact that we need these really long connections, but not everything was as it seems in the beginning. So we did a first pass at combing through the data and trying to analyze it. And what you see here on the left is us essentially assembling a couple of chains from concepts to artifacts to concepts to artifacts and so on, and just seeing how far we can go without repeating content. And you can see that there are a couple that went decently far, but then we quickly would hit a dead end. Some of these only go as far as 3 individual steps. And in the charts on the right, you can see that there are a lot of artifacts with few connections, and there were a couple of simply just dead ends or isolated loops within this collection. So we took a second pass at the data and worked with the curators at the Henry Ford, who actually added a lot more concepts to artifacts, a lot more artifacts to concepts, and sort of tweaked that spread across the entire collection. And the result was already a much higher average of connections per artifact. And then on top of that, we had this nice hand-in-hand collaboration with the collaborators and the dev team, where we also adjusted our algorithms to prioritize certain types of connections with certain types of concepts tied to them, so that we could make longer and longer strands ultimately in the experience. And that got a lot better. You can see that there are still some short connections and sparse connections that remained. And we were kind of faced with the question of, how do we prevent content from repeating? How do we prevent dead ends? How do we avoid circular paths? And that's where AI connections can actually be really, really helpful. So when a user might arrive at a dead end and have already seen everything that's related to a certain concept, instead of recycling the same content over and over again, we can actually use a connection sort of as a hyper jump in the whole collection of Henry Ford, and point them to something completely new, random, and interesting, and keep the journey going.
And so this is what it looked like. So I'll show you both of the AI connections. So this is that visually similar gradient. And you can see in the GIF, we're doing a quick little like, hey, this is AI and this is what's happening. But this will actually, as Ben said, I think you used to call it a hyperjump. I'll use that too. This jumps across the collection, kind of helps you find a new place within there. And we'd love to talk in the Q&A. We did some interesting stuff to kind of make these actually pretty long, so we can have this kind of random length that can go 15 or more objects to do some really interesting diverse gradients. And then similarly, the color similarity, we actually, to Ellice's question earlier, what do we do with black and white objects? In this case, through prototyping and digging into the production, we actually went one step further and are actually showing very saturated objects. So we're doing this kind of multi-part gradient that lets you see this kind of beautiful color progression across the collection. And so again, it gives you this different type of connectedness, and it gives you this different way to hint at that, bigger sort of story that is happening across the collection.
Yeah, and finally, all those pieces came together, and we got this beautiful long connections and threads that had curated connections between concepts and artifacts. We had AI connections based on visual similarity and on color gradients. And we had threads that really minimized the repetition of content and try to prioritize always seeing new and interesting avenues.
So we thought we'd pause for one quick moment just to have some kind of idea starters on what's next and kind of reflect on our learnings. Again, this is sort of just the tip of the iceberg in just one kind of project. And so I'll start. I think for us, you can see kind of over and over, we really got into this idea of like, this is not a silver bullet. AI is not this thing you can just plug and play, drop your connection in and you have a cool idea. We sort of knew that going in, but we have to kind of relearn this on almost every project in a way, when you get excited about technology or technique or an idea and you just want to push for it. You have to find something that is authentic and true. But it is really in an exciting state, and it changed so much even over the course of the project. And it's really a time now that is changing so quickly and getting so interesting and so rich and so nuanced and so complicated. And, we're just touching on all the different pieces there. So the nice thing that's great about where the state is now is there's newer tools like Runway ML, which we're showing here, that allow you actually to kind of more quickly experiment. And so you don't have to go through the same steps that we did of coding prototypes and having them fail and not knowing to do and being in an existential crisis, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a little appendix at the end for other kind of inspiration resources as you might want to dig in.
I think for us on the kind of experiential side at the Henry Ford, you know, some of the key takeaway is just there are so many ways, right? There are countless ways to integrate AI into our collections, into our experiences. And that key question is really like when, how, and why? Like what is the ultimate purpose? Is it to kind of create this amazing, like cool image of, you know, big picture thing, or are you really trying to kind of be able to storytell a little bit with it? And as we get more and more into different types of AI and into different types of technology, it can really kind of feel like you're able to kind of hack your own collection, which is really exciting, and find new ways to interpret your own data and your own collections into brand new experiences.
Yeah, and that is also extremely fun on the technical side. And like Brett was saying, you know, we're really just scratching the surface of what AI and machine learning models can do in this environment. What we've been, you know, after this project, we've been playing around with the collection more and more, and actually started going down interesting avenues like this one, where you can extract sort of the visual essence of what artifacts in the THF collection look like, and then use AI as this creative tool where you can mash up to different artifacts and see what that comes up with, or just let it randomly create a mashup of a vase and a closet or a cabinet. And that's really intriguing. And you know, connecting it back to Brett's points, there are so many opportunities with the right tools, but it also requires very thoughtful and careful selection of those techniques, and being really mindful and aware of the bias that can lie within those.
And then from a data standpoint or a digital collection standpoint, I think the one big lesson we kind of already talked about it is that there isn't really a off-the-shelf tool that you just like throw your data into and it immediately gives you something awesome. Like there's this give and take between your data and then the algorithms that you're applying to it. In terms of like where we go from here, we did mention we have not 1 million, but 100,000 digitized artifacts. We have this constantly increasing group of digital artifacts, and people are looking at them more and more online. What could an online ML/AI experience look like versus an on-the-floor one? Do we move to an open data model and let people play around with that and see what they could do with it on their own? As we add more non-still image media formats like video, audio, 360-degree views, potentially 3D models, what can machine learning and AI do with that? And then just from a practical standpoint, like what can it do to help with the human metadata? So we do apply really good metadata, but it does take people to do that. So we have one collection that's hundreds of thousands of images of auto racing. Could ML and AI help us like identify drivers, identify cars, and potentially identify races so that human beings don't have to look through tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of images to do that?
Awesome. We really look forward to everyone's questions and can't wait to meet you all on Zoom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.